Snow came early that year, not with violence but with a tired patience, as though the sky itself had grown old and weary of watching people endure one another. It fell in slow, deliberate flakes, settling over the frontier town until every sharp edge softened and every sound seemed to sink into the ground. Roofs bowed beneath its weight, fences disappeared into white silence, and the long main street looked less like a road and more like a memory slowly being erased. Lamps glowed behind frosted windows, their light warm but distant, like kindness seen from afar. In the center of that quiet stood Ahivda, 22 years old, wrapped in a thin wool shawl whose threads carried the faint scent of smoke and pine. Her breath rose in small clouds before her face, each one a reminder that warmth was something borrowed, never owned. In her arms rested a wicker basket filled with handmade candles, each poured carefully by her hands, each one a small act of hope shaped from wax and patience. When she spoke, her voice trembled, not from weakness but from the cold that reached deep into her chest. "Please buy my Christmas candles," she said softly, pausing as if to gather courage. "I'm freezing." The words drifted into the air and vanished, leaving behind the ache of being heard but not answered. She moved slowly down the street, stopping at every doorway, every passing figure, offering light to people who rarely looked back. Some townsfolk turned their shoulders away as though she carried the cold with her. Others pretended to be busy, suddenly fascinated by snow on their boots or the grain of wooden walls. To them, she was an inconvenience, a reminder of histories they preferred to bury beneath fresh snowfall. Ahivda accepted each rejection with a small nod, her eyes lowering not in surrender but in practiced restraint. Survival had taught her how to hold pain quietly, how to keep walking even when dignity felt heavy. Yet with each step, her fingers stiffened, and the basket seemed to grow heavier, as if it carried not candles but every winter she had endured alone. She wondered why she kept returning to this town year after year, why she believed, against reason, that this time might be different, and whether warmth was something she was meant only to offer, never to receive. At the far end of the street, beneath the overhang of a supply store, stood Wabin Hale, 30 years old, a cowboy shaped by open land and long silences. His coat bore the marks of travel and weather, mended carefully rather than replaced, and his boots were worn smooth by miles ridden in thought rather than haste. Snow rested on the brim of his hat, melting slowly as though reluctant to leave him. His eyes held a quiet steadiness, the kind that came from a life spent listening to the land and learning when words were unnecessary. He had ridden into town for supplies and news, nothing more, yet something in the stillness made him linger longer than intended. When he noticed Ahivda, it was not her beauty that struck him first, though there was beauty in the strength of her posture and the calm of her face. It was the way she stood alone, offering light while surrounded by cold, as if she had learned to survive without expecting rescue. That unsettled him, stirring a feeling he could not name, and he wondered why the sight of her felt like a story he had been circling for years without knowing its beginning. He watched as she moved from door to door, her basket slowly emptying, not from sales but from time passing. Each refusal landed quietly, yet he could see how it wore at her, how endurance demanded more with every step. Something in him tightened, an old ache he had learned to ignore by keeping his life simple and his heart guarded. He noticed the small way her lips trembled when the wind bit too hard, the way her shoulders shivered though she drew them in tightly. A stirring of protective longing filled him, and he realized that the cold she bore was more than just snow, it was the loneliness he had felt in his own life mirrored back at him. When she finally reached him, she did not look up at first, as if already preparing herself for another dismissal. "Please buy my Christmas candles," she said again, her voice thinner now, stretched by the cold and the long day. Wabin met her eyes then, and for a moment the falling snow seemed to pause, as if the world itself waited to see what choice he would make. In her gaze he saw weariness, yes, but also a quiet strength that refused to be extinguished. He wondered how long she had been carrying that strength alone, and whether anyone had ever offered to share its weight. Without bargaining or hesitation, he bought every candle in her basket, placing the coins into her palm with a care that startled them both. Her fingers lingered around the warmth of his hand before she drew back, uncertain, as if afraid the moment might disappear if she held it too tightly. He gestured toward his horse and then toward the distant hills where his cabin rested among pines, half hidden from the world. "You don't need to stand out here anymore," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. Ahivda hesitated, the space between them filled with years of caution and the immediate bite of cold. Kindness, she knew, often came with expectation, and she had learned to be wary of both. Yet something in his eyes felt steady rather than demanding, and the thought of warmth pressed against her resolve until the choice felt both terrifying and necessary. The cabin was small, built of rough timber and patience, its walls darkened by years of smoke and solitude. A single window glowed with firelight, and when Ahivda stepped inside, warmth wrapped around her so suddenly that her knees weakened. She gripped the doorframe, steadying herself, overwhelmed by the simple luxury of heat. Wabin moved quietly, setting water to boil, offering her a blanket without stepping too close. They spoke little, allowing gestures to fill the space where words might stumble. She warmed her hands by the fire, watching the flames bend and rise, and wondered how long it had been since she felt safe enough to rest without listening for danger. He watched her from across the room, noticing how her shoulders slowly lowered, as if releasing a burden she had carried for years, and he wondered when his cabin had last felt like more than a place to sleep. When their eyes met, lingering slightly longer than either dared, a flutter of something unspoken passed between them, a warmth neither fire nor wool could fully give. Days passed in a gentle rhythm, marked by shared meals and silences that felt companionable rather than empty. Wabin repaired loose boards and split wood while Ahivda helped where she could, her movements careful, respectful of a space that was not yet hers. She mended a tear in his coat, her stitches small and precise, and he watched her hands with quiet appreciation. The air between them grew charged with a delicate tension, each touch accidental yet meaningful, each glance lingering slightly longer than propriety allowed. At night, candles burned low, their light softening the edges of the room and making the shadows kinder. Sometimes their eyes met across the table, curiosity and desire flickering like a second flame, and both looked away too quickly, unsure of what they were allowed to hope for. Yet each morning before the sun fully rose, Ahivda gathered her basket and prepared to leave. Old habits tugged at her like invisible threads, and no matter how warm the cabin felt, she feared trusting it too deeply. When Wabin asked nothing, only watched her go with quiet concern, it left him wondering what pain she carried that warmth alone could not heal. The town did not soften its gaze when she returned, nor did it forgive her for finding shelter elsewhere. Whispers grew sharper, eyes colder, and Ahivda felt the familiar weight of judgment settle over her again. Still, she stood in the snow, selling candles that now seemed to symbolize both survival and surrender. She told herself this was temporary, that she would not impose on Wabin longer than necessary, yet each evening she returned to the cabin with a relief she could no longer deny. In those moments, as the door closed behind her and the fire greeted her like an old friend, she wondered whether belonging was something one earned through endurance or something that arrived unexpectedly and refused to leave. The answer came riding in on the wind one afternoon, carried by hoofbeats that did not belong. Kachina Red Elk arrived with men at his side, their presence cutting through the town like a blade through cloth. He had once been promised to Ahivda, back when choices were made for her rather than by her, and his pride had never forgiven her escape. His eyes found her easily, sharp with possession rather than care. Before the town could react, before Ahivda could run, he took her, lifting her onto a horse as though reclaiming something owed. There were no screams loud enough to draw help, only the sound of snow falling over fresh tracks as they rode away, leaving silence behind. Ahivda's heart pounded with fear and fury, her hands trembling as she pressed against the horse, and for the first time in years she whispered the name she had almost forgotten could hold hope: Wabin. When Wabin returned to the cabin that evening and found it empty, candles still cooling on the table, the cold that filled him was deeper than winter. He searched the cabin, then the clearing, calling her name into the trees until his voice broke. Panic gave way to purpose when he found her beaded necklace half buried in snow, its broken string a quiet cry. He knew then she had not left by choice, and that knowledge settled into him like iron. He saddled his horse and followed the trail into the mountains, riding not with rage but with resolve, listening to the land and trusting the signs it offered. Every frozen brook, every wind-blown pine became a guide, and the thought of Ahivda alone, scared and defiant drove him faster than fear or exhaustion. The mountains rose like silent witnesses as night fell, their shadows long and unforgiving. When Wabin finally saw the place where she was held, guarded by men who believed fear was their strength, doubt pressed hard against his ribs. He counted nearly 100 figures moving near the entrance, their fires flickering like watchful eyes. For a moment, he considered turning back, the weight of his own insignificance heavy upon him. Then he thought of Ahivda standing alone in the snow, offering light to people who refused to see her, and he chose to move anyway. Each step he took through the shadowed trees was a blend of careful strategy and reckless hope, his heartbeat sinking with the fear that kept him sharp. Waiting for night to deepen, trusting patience over force, He slipped closer, moving with the land rather than against it. Inside the shelter, Ahivda sat bound, her wrists aching, her spirit strained but unbroken. Kachana's words pressed upon her, promises twisted into threats, yet she held her silence like armor. When Waban finally reached her and cut the ropes with a small knife, his hands trembled despite his care. She did not cry out when she saw him. She simply pressed her forehead against his chest, relief and disbelief mingling until neither could be separated. In the quiet, her lips brushed against his coat, a promise of trust and something more, and Waban's steady arms held her as if to never let go. They fled before dawn, moving like shadows through snow and pine, the world holding its breath as if unwilling to interfere. The horse waited at a distance just as Waban had planned, and together they rode until the mountains fell behind them. When they reached the cabin, safe for the moment, exhaustion and gratitude settled over them like a shared blanket. Outside, snow continued to fall, indifferent yet beautiful. Inside, candles burned softly, their light steady and warm. Days passed, and the cabin became a haven where laughter returned like a long-lost sound, where quiet touches grew into shared warmth, where glances became unspoken promises. Ahivda and Waban, once cautious and burdened by the past, learned to let the fire of trust and love burn steadily. One crisp morning, surrounded by the hills, the snow, and the flickering candlelight, Waban took Ahivda's hands in his, their fingers entwined, and asked her to be his wife, not out of necessity, not out of fear, but because love had finally found the space to grow. She smiled, the weight of winter's past melting in that single moment, and whispered yes. And so, beneath the gentle snow that came early that year, their lives intertwined in a quiet, enduring warmth. What had begun as survival had become choice, what had begun as distance had become home, and the candles that once symbolized hope alone now glowed with love that promised to endure all seasons.